Hello, I'm Mehmet, Turkey Program Coordinator at the Project on Middle East Democracy. I'd like to welcome everyone to our panel, Istanbul, 1 year after Imamolu's mayoral win, the view from civil society. I will be moderating today's discussion. One of the results of President Erdogan and his AKP's prolonged rule in Turkey is the outsized influence it has afforded the ruling elite over civic space and civil society. In Turkey, a multicultural and politically polarized country, the civic space is particularly contentious. Over the last 2 decades, the AKP used its continuous rule to expand its control over the public sphere and reshape Turkey's cities according to its own social, political, and economic values, values that are fiercely contested by half the population. The most controversial interventions include urban planning that exacerbates social inequality, harms the environment, or alters the city fabric. Supporting cultural activities, coordination, and human rights activities. These issues have driven widespread public discontent. In 2013, they even led to mass protests, which started in Istanbul's Gezi Park and quickly spread on to public parks across Turkish cities. All this changed last year with the stunning election of opposition mayors in Turkey's biggest cities. The upset shattered the AKP's municipal dominance and offered previously neglected social groups some influence over the public sphere. Istanbul, my home city, elected its first opposition mayor in 25 years, Ekrem Imamoğlu. This major transition of power in Turkey's biggest city and cultural capital revitalized civil society and brought fresh air to civic and cultural life. Today, 1 year after Imamolu's victory, we'll discuss Istanbul's civic space and civil society and how opposition rule has changed them. Let me briefly introduce our outstanding panelists. Yaşar Adanalı is an urbanist and director of the Center for Spatial Justice, an Istanbul nonprofit working toward more fair, democratic, and ecological urban and rural spaces. Mehmet Ergen is the general art director of Istanbul City Theaters, which is operated by the municipality. And Ayla Yackley is a journalist based in Istanbul, and she's written extensively on all these issues. Now, I'll ask our panelists 2 rounds of questions, and then we'll move on to audience questions. If you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, at the bottom right of your screen. I apologize in advance if I'm unable to get to your questions due to our limited time. We'll wrap up in an hour at noon. So Ayla, I'd like to start with you. You covered both of Imamolu's elections last year, both his original victory in March and then his second decisive victory in the June 23 rerun. Imamolu was a candidate who pledged an agenda of radical change and progress. What were his main promises as a mayoral candidate as it pertains to civic space and freedom specifically? You're muted.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me now. Sorry about that. Mayor Imamolu yesterday held a kind of a celebration, but more what he described as a giving an account of the past year, his first year in office. And in that address, he focused on a key campaign promise that was to do away with wasteful spending, as he called it, at City Hall. And he said that by cutting off funds to a handful of foundations and charities that are close to President Erdogan's circle, he was able to save some roughly $100 million over the course of the year. Ending the ruling party's patronage networks was central to his campaign and resonated with a lot of voters. So that was a key campaign promise. It does involve civil society although it might be, it's groups that aren't necessarily who had felt more marginalized under the last administration. These are organizations that are close to the government. I think it's important to note here, because it really, I think, has been a theme over the last year, that Imamolu dedicated a good deal of his speech to talk about the obstacles that have been placed in his path by the central government, from limits on his budget to an AKP-dominated city council that has blocked some of his ambitious plans for the city. And in a stark reminder of the pressure that the government still exerts over municipalities, whether they're held by the opposition or by the ruling party, was that within hours of his speech, news emerged that a court had upheld a nearly 10-year sentence of Canan Kaftancıoğlu, who is the chairwoman of this opposition party, Republican People's Party, Istanbul branch, but she's also credited with helping craft Imamolu's winning strategy last year. And she can appeal the ruling, but it was for social media posts that she had written, if I'm not mistaken, 7 years ago. And the fact that it came on the anniversary of Imamolu's victory sent a clear message to the opposition that the government does still bear a grudge over the stinging loss of Istanbul.
No, that's true. That going after Canan Kaftancıoğlu actually says a lot. Someone so central to Imamolu's campaign says a lot about the government's attitude towards this. I want to talk about how Istanbul has changed in the last 25 years. So I want to actually turn to Yaşar for this. Istanbul changed considerably, of course, in the last 25 years of governance by the AKP, whose policies really fueled local civic movements to push to reclaim the city. I have two related questions about that, since you're an urbanist. How did the city change physically and spatially? And what were the main grievances stemming from that about public space of those Istanbulites who voted for a change with Imamolu?
Yeah, sure. First, we have to mention that Erdogan was the mayor of Istanbul roughly 25 years ago. But since 2002, his party was running the country as well. So Istanbul is not only governed from Istanbul, but it is mainly the decisions are made in Ankara at the capital. And it's important to remember that almost for the 20 years, both the central and the local government run by the same party. So it had a tremendous impact on the changes in Istanbul. And since 2002, we also have to mention that the Turkish economy in the AKP rule heavily relied on construction and extraction sectors. So the construction sector, through introduction of mega projects, through introduction of urban renewal schemes nationwide, the whole country has changed dramatically, but Istanbul was at the center of that economy. 20% of Turkish population lives in Istanbul, roughly, but 30% of its GDP is produced in Istanbul. So through mainly these mega projects that are almost like dropped from top down, with almost no local participation in the decision-making processes, the city started to transform radically to a level that now someone who hasn't been in Istanbul in the last, let's say, 15 years, if visit again, probably wouldn't recognize the city. From the moment that that person lands Istanbul in a new airport, from the new highways that it takes, and go to the city center, even at the very center, even the Taksim Square itself, the very central square doesn't resemble what it used to be 10, 15 years ago. So that is one point we have to make clear. The city tremendously changed. And in terms of the grievances that you mentioned, you ask, we have to remember not only the center of the city has changed, but now after the land in the center has evaporated, let's say it's been built up by these new projects, new mega projects, construction. The north of Istanbul, which is like a huge green belt, it's called like the lungs of Istanbul, the forest of Istanbul, the water reservoir of Istanbul. Through the mega projects like the new airport, the new bridges, the canal project, something resembling Suez Canal, the north of Istanbul is also open to urban development. So that is the most drastic change of Istanbul that we have to mention. The very ecological reserve areas in the last 10 years increasingly is open for the urban development. And that, of course, have a huge environmental impact, a huge social impact because there's no participation in these transformation processes. And there's a big impact on the democracy, since these projects are not transparent or not really open for democratic debate. They're just dropped from top down with very little participation of the local citizens. That also kind of signify the democracy deficit that we have been experiencing increasingly in the last decade.
Yeah, so lots of development without really consulting the actual residents of the city who have a large stake in it. I also want to turn to, with this discussion, it's great setting the scene, to the arts and cultural scene, because Istanbul is, of course, the cultural capital of Turkey, and arts and culture at really the center of its identity and life. So I want to turn to Mehmet to ask about that, and which is mainly, how did AKP rule in Istanbul affect the city's art and cultural life throughout these decades? I mean, of course, there's the big glaring problem of censorship, which impacts all art in Turkey. But I'm curious, how does local leadership influence the cultural life of a city like Istanbul?
Well, as Yaşar was saying, starting with Taksim Square, which is the heart of the town, Atatürk Cultural Center alone was the major hub of the city. It had an opera house, the ballet was there, the National Theatre was there, there's a videotheque doing arts movies. This is like the very first Art Deco cinema that was on Istiklal Caddesi, Istiklal Street, Emek, that was closed. Another major historical theatre, Muammer Karaca private theatre, is closed. El Hamra, for nearly 50 years, it hasn't been around. When you look at the landscape within a major high street in a European level, had about 5,000 seats. So when you don't have 5,000 seats of cinemas and theaters, that's 3,000 taxi cabs and 2,000 bottles of water, or whatever you use on your underground. The economy that cross-fertilizes these industries didn't really work. As Yaşar was saying, building industry, the structure was the main thing. So a very interesting point is that including the National Theatre and the State Theatre and the private theatres, even the alternative scenes, like tiny experimental theatres, they all ended up being in shopping centres. Now, we can't think of a shopping centre without a cinema or a theatre in it. Furthermore, even really big complexes like the Zola Center, for example, which was meant to be the land that shouldn't be occupied as a sort of public space, has again thousands of seats. There's like 2,200 seat theater, there's another 700 seat theater, a multiplex with about 10 cinemas, studio theaters, club scene, jazz clubs. This sort of creates a very insular scene where owners of these places expect audiences to come in so that they can shop, they can eat, they can pay for the car park, they can let their kids run around, then they can see a play as well. That's like a bonus thing. So you don't make an effort to go to a theater, you make an effort to go to a shopping center, and after dinner you might also see a play. So that's a big change in terms of behavior, because buildings don't have any identity in that sense. Even where I'm sitting now, behind me, there's these guys who set this theater up in 1920s. Were in a convention center, part of the convention. Even the Mohsin Ertuğrul, who was the founder of this theater in 1914, one of the oldest theaters and biggest regional theaters in the world, is inside the center. It's individual building has been knocked down. So we're surrounded by hotel chains and galleries that cater for business. So the European Western idea of cultural centers now moved into this compensated areas, if you like. But in terms of how the party behaves, of course, the Turkish political scene, every party has to have allies in different ethnic and religious groups, progressive people. You have to sort of embrace everyone. Therefore, an average Turkish political party doesn't really have an identity in that sense. And when a theater, like a national theater or the municipal theater, which are two examples that are the biggest theaters in the world with no comparison to anywhere else, from Japan to US, you don't find a theater with hundreds of people working in it and producing like at least 100 plays a year. What you find yourself is that the repertoire has to embrace everyone like the politics does. So you have to do conservative plays, you have to do center-forward nationalist plays, you have to do the European classics. There doesn't seem to be any identity because it's always this compromise that affect the way these theaters run. And so that finds itself in the cinema as well, in a sense that there's a massive increase in TV production. Turkish television did a major move towards selling its, as much as America, it sells TV dramas from around the world to everyone. And cinema is doing really well as well. But again, they're in shopping centers, they're shot in shopping centers. There's a bit of a embracing the wrong side of the city, if you like.
Yeah, so some of the products that you're mentioning, the change is related to what Yaşar was talking about with the construction boom, but also with the cultural changes that have been brought by a more conservative leadership.
Yeah.
I see. I want to turn back to Ayla and get some of your impressions on, as we were talking about, the broader civil society. And you know, when I think about the NGOs, the government has been openly targeting NGOs focused on democracy and human rights for at least the last 4 years, but even longer. And I'm wondering, how did Imamolu's election affect civil society in Istanbul in this regard? To what extent can local politics support civil efforts towards bottom-up democratization in a centralized political system like Turkey's?
I don't think we can underestimate the morale boost that Imamolu's victory gave to civil society groups that had felt marginalized under the last administration. I mean, it sent this very clear message that change was possible. And among the things that I would imagine these groups believe needed changing was that since 2016, more than 1,400 NGOs across the country were closed following the attempted military coup. So that has created quite a void. What is the role of the municipality in cultivating society? I think my colleagues on this panel can discuss their firsthand experiences, but I do think it's worth mentioning here that, at least from what I've observed, Imamolu has been quite focused on bringing local government into the role, that the city itself continue to offer the kinds of services or welfare that have pre-existed his tenure. The provision of these services helped make the AKP and the political movement that predates it as popular as it has. That said, I do think that there's a couple of key groups that are who have been particularly heartened by Imamolu's election, and Yaşar touched upon that for certain. I think environmentalists and urban planners in particular have been cheered by Imamolu's strong stance against Kanal Istanbul, this artificial waterway that Erdogan wants to build that would render the European side of Istanbul into an island. Its official price tag is about $13 billion, but economists think it'll take twice as much at least to build it. And environmentalists are warning that it'll wreak just untold environmental destruction to an area of the city. So that the fact that Imamolu has been so focused on that issue and has, over the course of his tenure, repeatedly said, we're going to do everything we can to stop this, has really cheered urban planners and environmentalists. For his part, Erdogan has said that Imamolu has no say in this project. So we'll see where this eventually winds up. But that morale boost that I talked about, it really shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah, it certainly means a lot to the dozens of people who are actually parts of these trials, just simply for their advocacy and work on human rights and democratization. And that morale boost is important for all these sectors. Let me get back to Mehmet, please, and ask about sort of how this has affected the art scene, because local politics also has an impact on the culture. And last year's election, of course, had a direct impact on you. You were appointed shortly afterwards to lead the city theaters, which puts together all the major productions in Istanbul, as you explained. So your new position is itself one of the changes this election produced. Now, the pandemic has certainly slowed down cultural life. It hit Istanbul right during festival season. But putting that aside, what kinds of opportunities, if any, did the new mayor bring to Istanbul's cultural scene?
Well, people like me who never think that there will be any opportunities in the National Theatre or the State Theatre or the Municipal Theatre in any level, because we're sort of used to that idea that they will not call us. There's party politics and the party supporters usually are in there. It's been so long with the AKP. We've never had calls from Ankara to say, would you be interested in doing anything? I mean, I've been running an opera season for the past 11 years in England, for example. Nobody ever asked me if there's any further development of the form in this country, or theatre or new writing. I've done a big project starting from Iranian border city of Van up to Istanbul, going to 6 major cities, working with 200 young people, and asked them to write their very first plays. And I also brought them together with American and British and Irish playwrights. So these are major projects in any country when you do something like this, which, I worked in Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium. People hear about you, and you are someone that could be useful in that sector. But in our own country, we've never been useful in that sense. And particularly after the Gezi protests that I was also part of, and I've also written a play called Taksim Square. There's a tiny bit of a budget for private theaters that every year you can apply and get something like $10,000 if you're lucky. That was immediately cut. And unlike any democratic country, there wasn't any marches around saying, why don't you pay us just because we don't think like you? Because, you don't think like the government, you don't get paid. That was a sort of the deal. So there was a big surprise in Istanbul to my appointment. And some of the papers called me pro-Kurdish, some called me, pro-Gezi, some called me other things. But at the end of the day, I think people in the know knows that you're useful for a major organization and you can move things forward. So there are many young writers directly write to me, send their plays, many young directors, many young actors that will make the new generations. I'm also aware of the demographics. I mean, let's not forget, Istanbul is 16 million. It's almost like 16 big cities in Europe. So there are some areas, the population of that local area is bigger than 40, 50 of the Turkish cities. Places like Sultan Gazi and Ümraniye, that should be in like German terms or British terms, would be the regional theater of that town rather than being one of the theaters in Istanbul. So you need to think on so many different levels in terms of demographics. You have a young audience, we have the cheapest ticket prices, but that's like handed over because the status of an artist in state theaters and municipal theaters are same as civil servant, which is very lucky, like the old Russian Soviet system. Once you become an actor or director in a big municipal theater, you're there for life. This is a good thing in terms of the town will never be without a theater, but sometimes it could be quite restrictive because the current politics could be different from the previous or the next politics, and you need to sort of adjust yourself. But I think public always know how sincere you are as an artist, whether you're doing what you believe in. A big question in Turkey, I find, in terms of arts, not so much censorship. I'm excluding the journalism on this one, that's having much harder time, but the self-censorship is a major issue. Any play, music, film that you think delves into certain issues, before even you consider what would happen to you if you did that, artists already cancel the idea out. But when it's done, it's usually not a major problem.
Yeah, no, that's it still creates a lot of, there is clearly a lot of opportunity, the way you mentioned, for the arts and cultural scene. And we'll see more in the upcoming years, of course, hopefully post-pandemic. I want to go back to the urban space and the opportunities this also created. Ayla quickly mentioned that there's more environmental groups, urbanists involved now in the municipal decision-making and particularly urban planning. Now, you run an organization that I find very interesting. It's for spatial justice. So could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, what is the center trying to achieve? What kinds of awarenesses are you trying to build for policymakers and the public, and what kinds of policy changes would you like to see in the city, and of course how the local government relates to that kind of work?
So our Center for Spatial Justice, in Turkish Mekanda, Adalet, Derneği, it is acronym stands for MAD, M-A-D, no? And that is a kind of, it's not really only coincidence. Well, we are a MAD, we call ourselves a MAD institution against MAD projects in defense of sane policies. Because these mega projects, they were introduced roughly in 2009-10 as the MAD projects. You know, this kind of one man's dream, MAD projects, gonna change the cities of Turkey, you know? And we were arguing for sane policies. First of all, the cities shouldn't be transformed by these projects. There should be sane policies collectively decided in a more democratic environment that takes at the center humans, nature, and our heritage. So our organization mainly focuses on knowledge production, but our team is a very cross-disciplinary team. We have architects, urban planners, journalists, artists, filmmakers, social scientists in our team. It's a small team of 12 people working, but then we have our volunteers around as well. And we try to highlight, by the kind of knowledge that we produce, try to highlight the right direction and the right policies. And in the past, I mean, in the previous, first of all, we don't only work in Istanbul, it's a nationwide organization, but our work, of course, also focus on Istanbul. And to have this kind of space for dialogue, space for participation is not kind of, wasn't always there. And with the current administration, there is this, we can observe, I can clearly state that there is more openness to our kind of organization that focus on certain very specific way of working in civil society, not providing services. You know, we are not a service provision organization, but really trying to intervene to policies, to politics. We see there's a new space of discourse, a space for dialogue. And it's a kind of big responsibility that there's a big claim from the mayor's administration, and as I mean, Mehmet was also highlighting, you know, as a new kind of someone, a bureaucrat with a new vision. And this is, we can sense that in every department of the municipality, there is this ambition, there is this vision, but that also kind of, I think, is really set the bar so high because organizations like ours and experts and activists like myself, we expect so much. So, and it's only been a year that this dialogue has started, and I'm hoping that it will transform into lasting policies. But as I said in the beginning, Istanbul is not run only from Istanbul. Istanbul is mainly run from Ankara. There's a lot of vested interest in Istanbul. And unfortunately, that kind of dialogue, maybe that now we have a window of opportunity in terms of civil society and the local government, but it is missing in the other actors are not part of this dialogue. And sometimes, it get into such a ridiculous way. Like, recently there was the conquest of Istanbul celebrations. I mean, the municipality of Istanbul had a fireworks party, which I'm against as an environmentalist. But 20 minutes later, the governorship of Istanbul had another fireworks party. Like in the same city, the two administrations, there's such a lack of dialogue that they have to put their own fireworks party, spending a lot of money, each of them, to show that who is running the city, who is there. Like this kind of symbolism is so much linked the way the city is governed now, and that is going to increase. We will have much more problems, and that's a problem directly affecting the quality of the democracy that we have.
No, that's true. The governorate in Istanbul, of course, is still AKP, so it is linked to the ruling party. And as you mentioned,
appointed, not elected.
Appointed, yeah, not elected. And so there's this constant competition between the mayor, the municipality, and not only the governorate, but also, of course, the administration and the various ministries trying to take over certain buildings and stuff. This competition is ongoing, which limits the powers of what a local leadership can really do about that, of course. I have a lot of follow-up questions myself, but I think I need to move on to Q&A because we have all these really good questions. So I'm going to go with one, well, I don't even know how to choose, but I'll go with one that is actually a very interesting question, and this one might be better for Ayla and neatly ties to what we've been talking about. So one of our respondents asked that civil society within what we call the AKP camp, the ruling camp, is also very dynamic. And you mentioned some of the NGOs that were getting funding from the municipality that were like that. And, it's really multi-faced. The question is, has the new administration of Imamolu given them space to voice their concerns? In other words, is Imamolu allowing for a real debate between organizations that used to sort of have a bigger dominance over the space and versus the newcomers that are just foraying back into that space?
I think that the answer is that it's a debate between elected officials. So it's a debate between Imamolu and Erdogan, or Imamolu and the governor of Istanbul, or the other ministers in the central government, rather than much of a debate between Imamolu and organizations that enjoyed more support and were involved in greater activities beforehand. So that's at least based on my observations. They can voice their disappointment or opposition also through the media. I mean, that's another really important point, that the media is still dominated by it's so overwhelmingly dominated. 9 out of 10 newspapers and television channels are either controlled by the government directly or by companies that are close to the government. So they have used those outlets to express their unhappiness with the change in regime. But I hope that goes some way towards answering that question.
Yeah, and I actually to stay with you, because there is a bit of a related question about how inclusive Imamolu really has been. So I'm going to that one is kind of a follow-up to this, but it's not just for the AKP aligned NGOs and civil society groups, but what steps has Imamolu taken to reach beyond Istanbul and Turkey for solidarity and cooperation with like-minded officials and civic initiatives around the world, so beyond Istanbul and Turkey itself. And part of the question is, will Imamolu's outreach efforts contribute to opening up the CHP, his party, and help it transition to a more internationally oriented stance?
I think so, and I think we've seen examples of that already, starting with the Imamolu's campaign and then into his first year. Let's start with his reaching beyond Istanbul. And I think there's a really solid example of how he's tried to do that. There's been a lot of ink spilled on this, but Imamolu was only able to win Istanbul with a kind of coalition. And perhaps the most significant part of that coalition were the estimated 1.5 million Kurdish voters in Istanbul who decided to support him when their party didn't field their own candidate for Istanbul mayor. That's been a challenge for Imamolu at times, in particular because of Erdogan's framing of the Kurdish political movement in security terms. That limits the CHP's ability or maybe even willingness to fully embrace Kurds. But Imamolu did reach out to them during the campaign, and since then, this is a critical point that I want to make. Parties from the HDP, whose base is largely Kurdish, have almost all of them have been removed from office since March 31st, 2019. Many of them, if not most of them, have also been arrested on terrorism investigations. So Imamolu went to Diyarbakir, the largest city in southeastern Turkey, after Diyarbakir's mayor was stripped of his office. He has expressed his support for them, at least when the expulsions first began. I think maybe that's petered out a bit over the course of the last few months. Something specifically in Istanbul that he's done is he offers Kurdish language courses through the municipality. So that there's that gesture as well. And then on the international front, if I just to take another minute, Imamolu has been compelled to turn towards European banks in particular, because he struggled to get any kind of loans that are traditionally provided by Turkish state banks to municipalities. He says he's been cut off completely. And so he's turned to European banks, and when he's traveled to Europe, he's also spoken at platforms that brought together European mayors as well. And he's been successful. He has been able to raise funds from Europe. Investors seem to like the story that he brings. They seem to like the fact that he's the mayor of this city that's the size of larger than many European countries. And so his outreach has been both financial, but it's also been cultural and social as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I actually have a quick follow-up to both Yaşar and Mehmet about this. I mean, in your areas of work, do you also see sort of increased or expanded cooperation or efforts towards cooperating with, potential, European or international networks, similar organizations, or municipalities themselves, which Istanbul is a sister city of many capitals around Europe. And so I'm wondering how much of that has affected your various areas.
Well, this is my first job in a big subsidized theater. I worked in many areas in Turkey. I directed in places like this, but in the management, you discover a few things. It's quite stifled in terms of European relations and intercontinental relations. It's always there. When I was in London, I'm still you hear from directors and producers, we write to national theatres and municipal theatres, they don't reply back. There wasn't much of an effort made to collaborate. It is much richer and more resourceful theatre than North European theatres, but the restrictions are in its structure. As I said, the actors are civil servants, and the budgets are completely given by the council. There are restrictions on getting sponsorship, which everyone would love in any theatre in the world. You would actually have a company pay you money, but we can't receive money, we can't pay other companies money, We can't go to Europe and get their box office if we tour. So in one sense, it's an ideal organization because everybody would want an international company who doesn't want any money. We'll just come and perform, just, we'll pay for everything. Don't worry, pretend rich. So these opportunities are still here, but none of them were really tapped in fully. There was some politics, I suspect, because there's been international touring has been up to the Balkans, where there is a sizable Turkish-speaking community in Bosnia and in Kosovo and Macedonia. These tours happened. Some into Middle East happened, but we didn't really see Turkish state theatre or municipal theatre performing in London or New York or Paris. That was never the aim. Or, that could be part of the general characteristic of the Turkish artists not really feeling like they would be worthy in those stages. But in terms of bureaucracy as well, it just didn't work. And it's also a question of intercultural projects. Like I'm working with a company in Amsterdam at the moment. They say, oh, we'll bring you a director and then let's do a project exchange and exchange monies. And we can't really do that. We either pay for everything or we pay for nothing. So it's a very restrictive structure in that sense. But in terms of ideas, it's much more open, and it's so hefty and it's so in size, so huge. Sometimes doing a lot less makes you more successful. And some of my predecessors may have done that. And also it's slightly, it's a shorter life. The theater's open here. It's a hot country. It's Southern Europe, like Greece, like Spain. By the time May comes, May, June, July, August, everyone's down the beach. There's no theater, unlike cold European northern countries where things happen all the time. So that's one challenge, to work more and create more opportunities. But in terms of relating it to the current government, they're very open. Imamolu himself is very open to have more on a bigger scale, more national relationships, putting the brand of Istanbul to everywhere in Turkey and into the neighboring countries and into Europe and in America. These are very doable things as long as bureaucracy doesn't really stifle you, which I'm very used to.
So maybe just not stifling is enough of a boost for those kinds of efforts at this point.
Well, to give you an example, when I took over in October-November period, there were 2 productions with plays with 2 characters in it. So 4 of the actors were working. And this October, we're planning to open 17 new productions. So it's very doable. I have 400 actors on a payroll. So it just takes a telephone call to get them working. But like all big machines, if you'd want to do less, you could be less visible, which could work if you don't really want to work so much.
On our side, I can clearly say that there's an increased interest in by the international actors, organizations, mainly in terms of civil society, local government relations, and its potential for local democracy, kind of democratization process in Turkey. That is not exactly the same, but around 2008, 9, 10, Istanbul was again very much kind of at the center of these global interest. We have been receiving similar kind of attention, but that time the world was much more global, the world was much more open, and the image of Istanbul was somewhere a kind of cool city that everyone wanted to be or somehow do something about. And in the last year, I can say that there is definitely more interest from the international actors. And we work with a lot of international organizations. And the shift of interest moved to this kind of the potential of the cities to provide not only livable spaces, but democracy.
Yeah, no, that's It's a really good point. I actually have there's another question that's related to this before I move on to other aspects about international cooperation and what that could mean for particularly the possibilities of particularly collaboration with the EU on communal and civil society level as a way to strengthen artistic, entrepreneurial, and free civil society scene amidst the sort of overall national and also local polarization and conflict among society. So can that kind of collaboration provide a direct source for sustainable cultural expression and identity? I think we sort of talked about it, but what is the sort of potential that provides?
I mean, it's already been providing that. I mean, these sort of not only EU, but there has been for some time this wave of support coming to Turkey. I mean, maybe it is increasingly one-way kind of support. We are not in the times of kind of mutual cooperation and increasing the kind of dialogue between different civil society organizations around the world, but there is this channels of support, and I think it will increase in the near future, at least from the kind of contacts that we have. I can say that there's an interest on kind of finding ways, but I mean that is not the sustainable way, right? Like the support has to come from within Turkey, and that support has to be kind of constructed from within Turkey, and that support has to find its ways, its channels between the municipalities and civil society, and eventually it's a kind of also involving the national central actors. I mean, yes, we know it is not there at the moment, and yes, the local government trying to open certain channels of dialogue between civil society or the cultural artistic society with the local governance, but the sustainability can only come from within these searches.
Yeah, and in the art scene, I guess there is sort of the problem of language as a barrier for more collaboration, particularly in terms of theater. You already mentioned performing, either international people performing in Istanbul or vice versa, but there could be much more opportunity, particularly in film. You have Istanbul has a big film festival scene, and you see a lot of international foreign movies coming in, also collaboration between directors and producers and all of that. And that kind of, does that scene see an expanded or kind of a grown opportunity of collaboration in that sense coming between European cities, municipalities, but also agencies?
Well, municipalities and the state and local government funded organizations are usually, because of their size, creating links and opportunities can be slower. In a very strange way, the independent art scene in Turkey is a lot more exciting than the hugely funded state organizations, because you can basically make a phone call, go on Facebook, WhatsApp, invite people, they fly over, you do workshops, they come to direct plays, they could be a choreographer, they could be a musical director, these things happen. But in big organizations, it's usually you fill certain forms, who is coming from which country, where will they stay, who pays them, how much we pay, what's the tax situation, and then you kind of give up. I personally don't, because I'm new, but this actually, bigger you get, easier the relationship should happen. But in the state and municipal fund organization, it works the other way around. This has to change, I guess. Yes. But the opportunities are really there, because I mean, there was a theater recently came from Hamburg, and they said, oh, we're really big. We have a 2,000 seat theater, we have a 500 seat theater, we have a 200 seat theater. I have 40 actors, and this is like we're talking about Hamburg. And I said, we have 11 theaters. One of them is 5,000 seats. I have 400 actors. she was suddenly like, this is impossible. I said, it is possible. You can just send me a German director and then start working tomorrow. Opportunities are always there, but sometimes because of this political habit of decades of AKP rule, a lot of artists rule themselves out of the art scene, working with those big organizations. And this is not really a political speech in that sense, because even Erdogan himself says, we failed in culture. Of course, he means on a major scale that him and who is around him. A lot of the small independent companies have not failed. We still work, you know, the new rich AKP supported classes have to end up come and see the plays of the people they don't like, have to see the films that people make and they don't like. And sometimes they attempt to make their own films and nobody sees them. So they clearly realize that they need to boost the infrastructure, working with the people they don't really like.
That's true. I mean, it's interesting really what he means when he says we have failed in reaching in the art and cultural scene. It seems to be not necessarily an all-encompassing, you know, inclusive kind of foray into that world, but more of like a one-sided, you know, failing to transform that scene maybe into something that is more aligned with the ruling party's values, which is, of course, in itself a very profound statement to make, particularly after 20 years. But it's also profound that they, you know, he calls it a failure and that there needs to be more done.
Here's a word. I mean, it's been one of the major problems of the ruling party, that they could not manage to create their own intelligentsia. With all the money in the world, with all the opportunities in the world, with all their family ties and all the sect ties, everything was in their hands. It just didn't happen. A, they didn't care so much, and B, they didn't realize that cross-fertilizing economical impact of the arts. Like in Britain, every £1 that British government gives to artists, they receive 6 back. There are millions of people seeing plays, meaning millions of people take the tube, take the cabs, and you know, all the sets built, lighting designs, electricity, power. They don't seem to realize that for the big towns here. They leave it to, it works the other way around. You support a company, you give them a permission to build a massive shopping mall, and then they may have a theater in there, and then that may bring some people in, but not directly. Artists and government are not linked together. There's always a preliminary private sector. I mean, it's very interesting. It probably doesn't really happen in any other country. Banks like Akbank, Yapı Kredi, İş Bankası, 3 major banks control the 3 major publishing houses. If they didn't exist, many of the European literature wouldn't be translated. There wouldn't be theater awards like Afife. There wouldn't be İş Sanat, Aksanat. There wouldn't be major arts installations, digital arts form, film festivals supported. So 3 banks end up doing everything. I know in America this is quite a common culture as well. But to me, to talk to a bank in England, it would be like 6 months of emails. Here you walk in and you start working. So middleman in the Turkish arts is the banks. The big brother is the government, which only supports itself. And the independents are just hanging around people, like more Imamolus to be created with the support of the pro-Kurdish parties.
Yeah, well,
that was complex.
It's remarkable.
Just sum up.
Yeah, it's still remarkable though, despite all of those things, how much it's flourishing, the art and cultural scene, and despite the pandemic, which I want to keep bringing up. I have one question, which is a big thing, you know, looking outside to Turkey, about the question of refugees. Of course, Turkey has, I think, now 4 million Syrian refugees. Hundreds of thousands of them are in Istanbul, and this has been a major issue for Imamolu. It has kind of constrained his ability to promote this like inclusive message that he has been applying towards all of Turkey's other more marginalized or neglected communities. But do you think at on the local level, given that Istanbul has the highest concentration of these of Syrian refugees right now, has on the local level, has he been more, and Ayla, I think this is more of a question for you, but everybody can feel free. Has he been more efficient or effective than his predecessors, and how has he approached this issue? As we know, the general sentiment in Turkey is very anti-refugee, same in Istanbul, so it's been a challenging topic.
I can try to answer the question. The biggest impact that Imamolu seemed to have on the refugee issue was he did give voice to some of the discontent in Istanbul with the refugee issue. He sort of described it as a policy that had gone out of control, with so many people who may be registered in other parts and settled in other parts of the country coming to Istanbul, inevitably where most jobs are. You know, it accounts for about a third of GDP. So understandably, refugees would be drawn to Istanbul, but also maybe for personal or cultural reasons as well. It's Turkey's freest city. It's its most cosmopolitan and liberal city in a lot of ways. So he gave voice to that discontent during his election, but again, to claiming that it needed to be brought somehow under control. But within months, weeks even really, of his election last year, the government was spurred to action, and it began to move people who weren't registered in Istanbul back to camps. There were reports that the government did deny that people had been actually sent back to places like Idlib as well. So I suppose Imamolu bears responsibility for that. If the government was responding to what it's recognized as voter discontent, and that it was penalized for it, Imamolu helped contribute to that. However, ultimately, Imamolu lacks the authority and the resources to have done some of those things, to send people back to the border or across the border. That ultimately was the government's decision and its policy that it put into place.
I would like to comment on that briefly. I mean, I think that is a kind of weak spot of this whole inclusive policy debate. I mean, because clearly the impact of refugee debate on the local government results was there. Everyone recognized that. The central government recognized that. And the kind of coalition the opposition get into build, they had a very outspoken anti-refugee politics as well within that kind of coalition. And the central government recognized that, as Ayla was mentioning. So it is a kind of, yes, we know, that is kind of, let's not make this the most visible policy area. So that is the kind of sentiment that we get from, not only from Istanbul municipality, but all the municipalities that change the parties. And so that is our common denominator of the opposition and the government supporters at the moment, being anti-refugees, being anti-Syrian, being kind of, and that is, we will have to face with that. I mean, we will have to kind of be more openly discussing what it means, and we will have to be more courageous on taking position, because precisely because of that change, we saw just before the pandemic what the refugees suffered. You know, they went all the way to the borders, and they've been kind of in this limbo stage for days, and they don't know what is going to happen. They've become this kind of a pawn in the game of Turkish politics. And we, as the kind of right-based organizations, we have to be there kind of voicing this problem.
Yeah, it's certainly, this is an area where the municipality can and should be doing more to create some sort of more just environment and for these refugees, the new settlers of Istanbul, the new population. So we're running out of time. So I'm just going to take this one question, which I think is a great concluding question, and ask it to all of you very, very briefly, please, which is that it's hard to judge, just only been 1 year, half of it has been a pandemic, but what do you think so far has been the biggest legacy of the new Imamolu mayorship in Istanbul, either as it pertains to your areas or in general? Ayla?
I mean, I think that I'm going to go back to this idea of a morale boost that he did show to those who felt marginalized that change was possible. He does face criticism, and maybe it's worth mentioning that too, that there's been more gestures or rhetoric than action, at least in some areas. His critics blame him for everything that goes wrong in Istanbul, including a really bad storm yesterday. It seems he got blamed for the weather even, but even his admirers do express a degree of cynicism, but that has to do with this perception that his hands are tied, that he's that he's unable to fulfill the role of the office. And I do think that there is a relatively universal sentiment in which you can be easily disappointed when an outsider is elected amid a great deal of hope and hope for change. And in some ways, the fact that Mayor Imamolu remains in office and continues to be an outspoken, if at times limited, but still an outspoken critic of the government. I mean, that in itself may be a feat.
It's giving a lot of support. One maybe sentence from the two of you.
Sorry.
Well, I think the shift in the balance of power is a major thing. I mean, that's just by the fact that now the mayor is from another party, that's good enough. I mean, it even changed the dynamics. You gave the example of the municipal parliament. I mean, how the majority is still in the AKP's coalition, which is a good thing. Now that this municipal parliament debates are broadcast live for the first time, and we the citizens can follow it. Because why? The mayor wants to show that they are trying to block his way, but for us, the common citizens, we are being kind of invited into the broader democratic debates, right? So I think this shift in balance of power is extremely important, and there's more space for democratic participation for everyone, and that was heavily needed for Turkish society.
Certainly. Mehmet, would you concur with the general?
Absolutely, yeah, and also, Justice and Development Party's development aspect was really hampered by the polarization, I think is the word that everyone's really distressed about. But Imamolu seemed to embrace the whole population without putting blames onto any other organizations or minorities. That's a good thing, but I think if he could get the local parliament behind him, there'll be more positive action in town.
Right. Thank you all for, I'm sorry I have to wrap up now, but thank you all to our audience for tuning in, and of course to all of our panelists for your invaluable insights. I learned a lot from this. I found it very informative, and I hope all our audience did too. Thank you.
Thank you, Maverick.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.